Okay, in this lecture, we're going to look at some of the archaeological remains from the Archaic era of Greece. Now, there's a lot of stuff we're going to cover, many slides. So there is an accompanying lecture at the website. If you go to the website for the course, scroll down to the bottom, there's something called Archaic Greece, Tyranny and Democracy. And that'll supplement this. And basically, the point I try to make is that as Greece emerged from the Dark Age after the fall of the Bronze Age, it was sort of torn between two diametrically opposed trends. One was particularism, a sense of identity with the immediate community you lived in, the small settlements, which became known as the polis or the city state, and these were ruled by local oligarchies. So you have big fish in small ponds, and they liked it that way. Every city state was independent and autonomous. And that was the preferred way of life in the Greek Aegean. But there was also this trend of pan-Hellenism, a sense of identity that of Greeks in the wider world. And one of the ways that Pan-Hellenism sort of manifested itself in the Archaic period was through the emergence of the great sanctuaries. The sanctuaries gathered information from throughout the Greek world, and they had a greater, shall we say, horizon, an awareness of what was going on outside of the immediate settlements themselves. And so they were the first in this movement of Pan-Hellenism, sort of an undulating pattern. It kind of reaches its peak during the classical era, which will be the next lecture in that. The rising population led to too many people, not enough food, and it led to sort of diametrically opposed trends again. One was colonization, going out and colonizing the wider Mediterranean world. The main site we point to is Corinth, which settled Syracuse, among others, Syracuse and Sicily in 734 BC. So these are early trends. This allowed them to ship out excess population, also brought in resources, but it also became a market for finished goods. And so it helped build the economies of the mother city. And the other option was increased warfare. You could fight to take the land of your neighbors. And this is what the Spartans did. They became defeated at a major battle. It set them in a tailspin. A lot of places they had conquered rebelled, and they had to completely reinvent their government and turn themselves into a sort of communistic, militaristic caste society in order to maintain what they had conquered that way. And they became the greatest military uh, uh, establishment in the Greek world as a result, leading to the emergence of the Peloponnesian League by 500 BC. Other cities, however, went with the colonization and trade. And so, as they grew larger, there were problems internally, and ultimately, leaders known as tyrants emerged. A tyrant was a popular leader, usually who seized power in his city states from the oligarchy, usually with widespread popular support. The great tyrannies we'll look at are that of the Caepsulids in Corinth in the late 600s BC and the Pisistrates in Athens in the middle 500s BC. And what these tyrants did was increase trade, increase finished production, and convert their states into export producing, trading communities. Both of these cities became very large. It is estimated Corinth at its peak, maybe about 100,000 people. Athens, with the emergence of the Athenian Empire in the 5th century, the estimates rise as large as 400,000 people, the largest city in the Greek world, kind of an anomalous in, community in that regard. A juggernaut, just much larger than the next largest city, Corinth, in that regard. So we're going to look at the evidence of the trade, and all of this occurred just prior to the Persian Wars. We like to say the Persian Wars marked the transition from the Archaic period to the Classical period because the Persian Wars, the Persians came, they threatened to conquer Greece. It was a moment at which all Greek states had to put down their squabbling and unite in order to defeat this external threat. And having done so, they became convinced that there was something unique about their lifestyle, their military, their gods, that made the Greek society, Greek culture, the greatest in the world. Kind of a positivism emerges from this, which we can see in many, many ways, intellectual developments being the main one. So there's your outline for the Archaic period. Early sanctuaries that were essential to this. We have Olympia, sanctuary to Heracles, sanctuary of Zeus, but by Heracles. Okay, the system's fighting with you. We'll see what damage it is. You're now viewing the sanctuary of Olympia. This is supposedly where Heracles cleaned the Augean stables and then bathed in a hot spring and then dedicated, performed the great sacrifice, taught humans how to sacrifice to his father. Here is the model, and the temple in the middle is the great temple of Olympian Zeus, constructed in the Archaic period and sculpted by Phidias, the great sculptor. There was a great um, altar out beside it, a giant mound where they burned hypocaustic sacrifices. The entire animal was burned, and it was a giant mound, apparently some 20 feet tall by its peak. Here is a view of the Temple of Hera. So we have a sanctuary where here is the remains of the sculptural work at the um, Temple of Zeus. This is Apollo who went to the dinner of the Lapiths. They invited centaurs who got drunk and began to grab all the women. This would have, you can see how it's triangular. It's sat in the pediment. The temple itself is pretty much in ruins. Here are reconstructions. It supposedly had a 40-foot tall ivory and gold statue of Zeus done by Phidias, the great sculptor from Athens, who had fled Athens during the just before the Peloponnesian War after the death of Pericles. And they were excavating a church on site and they found remains that indicated that it was based on the remains of the studio of Phidias. They actually found the inscribed by one of Phidias. And it's quite possible that that was his studio. Here is the stadium in Olympia. It never really got developed. It's kind of an example of what it looked like in the Archaic period. You just got the running track with a nice, easily sloped sides where people could put down blankets and sit and watch the performances. Our records of the Olympic Games, they listed the victors date back to 776 BC. And it's interesting that many, if not most, of the victors on these lists did not come from Greece. They came from overseas colonies like Syracuse, colonies in Italy and Sicily. Olympia faced to the west, it's on the Ionic Sea, and it was a place where people from who had gone off to colonies in the west could come back and sort of mingle with aristocrats, and it's all aristocrats, mingle with them and make marriage alliances and be in touch with the homeland, the motherland of Greece. And this is what I mean about how sanctuaries had greater intelligence and were able to be part of a wider Greek community. Here are the starting blocks at the stadium, and here it was a torsion contraption. Here is a reconstruction from the Maya of how it would have worked. The other great sanctuary was that of Delphi. Delphi was sacred to Apollo. There was an oracle there. Again, the beginning of the Delphic festivals is something like 692 BC. People from all over the Mediterranean came to Delphi to consult the oracle of Apollo there. This is excavated by the French school. Yeah, I should have pointed out Olympia was excavated by the German Institute of Archaeology in Athens. This is the French school in Athens. This is the oldest ongoing excavation in the world. I think it started in 1876 AD. What you have here is a slope, and so they had to build sort of a um, uh, sacred way that leads up a series of terraces up to the temple and the altar of Apollo, where the oracle was housed. And then there was a theater and a stadium further up the hill. Here's a view of the Sacred Way and many of the remains of the monuments. The building in the distance is the treasury house of the Athenians. So many uh, visitors came to ask the god for favors. And if you received your wish, then you would be required to put a votive offering. So many offerings came from certain cities that cities build a special treasury house to house them. And we have a description of Pausanias of the dozens of votives that were outside the treasury house of the Athenians. And it kind of served as proof to visitors of the greatness of this god. I mean, so many people had received their answers from to point out its importance overseas, here is a dedication. It was a limestone bell-like thing that on top of which was a tripod, dedicated by Gelon, the tyrant of Syracuse at Delphi. BC. Here is the remains of the temple. It was damaged by earthquakes. It was burned down. Went through a lot of trouble. It was a peristyle temple with a colonnade all on all sides. We're looking from the backside, the Epistodomus. They've never really figured out how this gaseous crevice worked. Supposedly, the seer, who would be a virgin woman selected from the community of Delphi, who could speak in tongues, would sit in a little room and breathe in the gaseous vapors. They think maybe it was kind of like laughing gas naturally coming up from a crevice in the earth, and then she would speak in tongues. The way it would work is a visitor would come with a question, the priest would go in and consult the seer, come back and give them an answer. Usually was kind of a vague answer in that regard. It's important to recognize, I always stress this, that the temple is where the icon of a god was stored. And then in the back room, the treasury of the god was stored. But the real focus of religious activity in the Greek world was the altar out in front. The altar is where the sacrifice would be performed. The sacrifice would invoke the god would come and infuse the statue in the temple with his or her presence, and then you could ask them for favor in that regard. And so it's always kind of, we look at the temples when we visit these sites, but it is the altar that was the true focal point of Greek religion. This one was actually kind of shows you how valuable this place was. This, according to this inscribed dedication on the floor, on the pediment, the steps of the altar, it says that the Delphians give Edokan to the Chians, the people from the island of Chios, promontiane, the right of first consultation with the god. The god was not always in. He didn't take questions for long. You wanted to be first in line. And so whenever the Chians came with a question, and the question might be, should I go to war with Samos? Should I found the colony somewhere? You wanted to be first in line when to get the answer. Some of the archaic art, there's a lot of it preserved at Delphi. The main one is the great charioteer, some sort of horse, big chariot, and we've got this very tall, deliberately tall, elongated, because it would have been viewed from below. So to take that optical illusion into effect. This is in the museum. Some of the monuments at Delphi, all the pagan sanctuaries were closed by the Emperor Justinian of Byzantium, Constantinople in the 6th century AD. And these became sort of mining operations to be plundered to embellish the new Christian capital of the Mediterranean world. So here we have the Snakes Column. It actually stands in the Hippodrome, the former Hippodrome in Istanbul. You can see the Egyptian obelisk behind it. This is where chariots would race around for the great chariot races right here. And the snake's head is in the Istanbul Archaeological Museum. This snake's column was put up by King Pausanias of Sparta, the king who defeated the Persian army at the Battle of Plataea in 479 BC. Moving to archaic cities, the first one we want to think about is Sparta itself. This is in the Valley of Laconia. You can see it at the bottom of the map there in sort of pinkish red, darker red. It was a very nestled valley that was protected by two long ranges, high ranges. The Taygetus to the west was reaches levels of 10,000 feet. It was kind of isolated. They built a military oligarchy. They started conquering neighboring peoples, particularly to the west, the Messenians. You can see Messenia there. And then they were defeated by a tyrant from Argos. Argos is up in the Bay of Argos at the Battle of Hyzea. And to recoil from this, the Spartans completely adapted their culture into a militaristic caste society. Whole society, including these serfs, which are called helots, was devoted to preserving the military oligarchy of Sparta. Here is a view of the Battle of Hyzea with an arrow showing you its location near Argos. Here is a view of the Taygetus Range. Sparta doesn't have a lot of archaeological remains. Famous for its great warriors. It wasn't a large army, but it was a fierce one. Here is the statue of King Leonidas in front of the sports arena at Sparta. Leonidas was the king who died fighting the Persians at the Battle of Thermopylae in 481. The most impressive remains at Sparta is the Roman era theater. The Spartans were not famous for their architecture or their writing, they were famous for their warriors. Here is a view of Messenia with Mount Ithome in the middle, and the sea is just beyond it. There were again, the Peloponnesus is largely mountains. There are very few alluvial plains, but between controlling Laconia and Messenia, the Spartans controlled 40% of the arable land of the entire Peloponnesus and remained basically self-sufficient in a subsistence sort of manner. One of the problems is they had these people of Messenia as serfs, so they really couldn't venture too far from the Peloponnesus without risk of Helot revolts. So it made Sparta an extensive oligarchy and a very conservative society. Two of the cities that went in the other direction are Corinth and Athens. First came Corinth. You can see Corinth's position on the isthmus. It straddles the two great seaways. If you were coming from Asia Minor, you would go to the Saronic Gulf to Corinth. Your goods could be offloaded there, dragged by mules over to the other side, and then you have the Gulf of Corinth, and from there you could make your way to Italy and Sicily. And it was safer to sail this way than to try to sail around the treacherous seas of the end of the peninsula, Cape Malea down there, where many shipwrecks, even today, some of the greatest ancient shipwrecks have been recovered. Here's a view of the Gulf of Corinth. Because of the mountains, it's not as windy. You can row galleys. It was the main waterway, shall we say, east-west waterway, and Corinth was positioned very well to take advantage of it. At first, there was an oligarchy called Bacchiadae that dominated this trade. Ultimately, the people of Corinth got frustrated with the oligarchy, and they selected a tyrant Caepsulus around 650 to take over and help everybody become part of a large urban community. Here is the Acrocorinth. All Greek city-states tend to have sort of three visible features. There will be an acropolis or heights where the inhabitants can flee in a time of refuge. So we can see the fortifications of the Phoenicians that are based on in situ on the remains of the ancient Corinthian fortifications. There's also going to be a marketplace, which they call an agora, and there will be a harbor, which they call the limet, because all Greek city-states were within 10 to 15 miles from the sea. All trade was done by sea. It was much more efficient. Just a close-up of the Acrocorinth as it stands today, the triple gates. Some of the big developments under the Caepsulids, the diolkos. So here is the dragway, a very stone dragway that they literally could haul ships from one end. It's about 11 miles to the other end. Probably not so much ships as it was wagons to haul the goods being offloaded at one harbor over to the other harbor. Around 1900, the Greek army actually excavated this canal. Now there is a canal through the isthmus. Other works, the earliest surviving Doric temple of the Greek world is the Temple of Apollo at Corinth, constructed by the Catholics around 650 BC. And then what we have is this very dark but very elaborately painted Corinthian fineware that became the most dominant, most frequently traded fineware of the 7th and early 6th centuries BC. So we have plenty of evidence of Corinthian economic strength that really made it the great commercial city of Greece prior to the emergence of Athens. Athens came a little late to these developments, possibly because you can see it's where the star is. It was Attica, the surrounding region, the tribal region, was a much larger territory, and so maybe it took longer for population pressure to hit in Athens. But we do know that the move for tyranny was already there was a push for it by about 621. Ultimately, an aristocrat named Pisistratus of Brauron was able to seize control in Athens in 565 to 527. His son Hippias was finally expelled in 510. There you go. About 50 years of control by strong men, and their job was to, again, sort of move the excess population to the city center, create crafts and artisan work, and create a proletariat in the city, and generate trade by founding colonies overseas and the like, and convert this sort of a pattern of um, um, subsistence villages into an urban community. The Acropolis is right there. One of the things he built was a giant temple. You can see the shadows of it, the temple of the Hecatompedon, which means the one sacrifice of 100. It was destroyed during the Persian Wars by the Persians. The remains of it, since it was sacred art dedicated to the gods, buried on site and was recovered. So we have these terracotta statues with very Assyrian-like hairdos and this almond-shaped eye, which kind of tells us this is an early phase in Attic art, when probably the artisans that were doing this art came from someplace closer to Phoenicia. At the end of the Persian Wars, the Athenians had to rebuild their defenses very rapidly, and so they took their columns and plugged them into the walls, as you can see up there on the northeast side of the Acropolis. Other buildings by the tyrant Pisistratus is the Temple of Olympian Zeus, intended to be the greatest, largest temple in the Greek world. Many cities competed to produce the largest city in the Greek world. This one was so large it never got finished. In the Roman era, Hadrian gave another big donation to get it finished, and it still never really got finished. Those columns stand, as you can see, about 40 feet in the air. Another thing he did was kind of centralize the religious cults. I'm talking about Pisistratus. So he brought various cults to the center of the city. He forced priests, if they were sort of um, ancestral priests of cults, nonetheless, they had to perform their cults not in their home villages, but on the Acropolis. And so one of the cults that he nationalized was the cult of Dionysus, out of which various satyr plays evolved, and he sort of encouraged poets to write hymns and write plays. Came the idea of two people stepping forward to engage in a dialogue. And so we can credit Pisistratus with the birth of Greek drama as well. All the great plays you may have heard about, Sophocles and Aeschylus and Euripides, many of these would, and Aristophanes, would have been performed here in the Theater of Dionysus. Again, it probably wasn't built up in the Archaic period. Most of the seating probably was constructed in the Roman era, but still, same sort of phenomenon in that regard, and the same sort of pattern of development that we've seen at Corinth. Other things he did, he again, Attic black figure was catching on. It starts around 580